All right guys, Sunday special number 3. Today we're going to be talking about California, its horrifically poor management, what can be done to prevent the next wildfire, and the alleged swamp of eco-bureaucrats in the government who've hijacked the permitting process for controlled fire burn. Critics claim these tree huggers have made it nearly impossible for the federal wildland firefighters to clear brush in flammable chaparral habitats like the Angeles National Forest, which is where the Eaton fire began several months ago. If you can remember, that fire was catastrophic, claiming 18 lives and destroying over 9,000 structures, mostly in the working-class suburb of Altadena. It was a disaster that led to a lot of finger-pointing, mainly at the city of LA, Cal Fire, Governor Newsom, and of course, the trans. But the true story is much more complicated, and it's one that we aim to tell to the best of our ability. Today we're going to be premiering our first ever In the Field segment, where I'll take a ride-along with a union chief from the Wildland Firefighters Union, Mr. Steve Gutierrez. And then we're going to sit down in this studio with environmental journalist and prescribed burn advocate Danielle Venton, who was warning of an impending disaster far before January's wildfires. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andrew Callaghan, and you're watching Fivecast, our weekly broadcast here at Channel 5, the largest independent crowd-funded newsroom on Earth. You're currently watching our Sunday special, but we actually do this episode twice a week, and our Tuesday show is available exclusively on our Patreon, where we host a variety of uncensored and extended content. Membership is $5 a month, which is annoying, but it's your subscriptions that keep us in business without having to sell out, so it's a very effective means of autonomy for us. Let's back up a bit. For a quick refresh, the wildfires happened during the 2025 election cycle, so naturally, the aftermath was politicized by both sides of the aisle. On the right, the conversation revolved around Jewish space lasers, DEI, and the homeless population, which if you ask me, is a perfect storm.
Tell us about Jewish space lasers.
Why don't you go talk about Jewish space lasers, and really, why don't you off? How about that?
Thank you very much.
The homeless do often reference space lasers and are certainly a diverse bunch, but that's not exactly why propagandists like Megyn Kelly and Charlie Kirk were thinking when they ran their content blitz. Their agenda is to smear blue states and cities, and because homelessness has been deeply criminalized through vagrancy laws in red states and counties, like in the case of the Grants Pass, Oregon ruling, which made it illegal to sleep in public even when there are no shelter beds available, there are many more homeless people living in woke cities like LA, who generally don't take you to jail for being poor. Perhaps punching down on the homeless also provides some form of spiritual protection for blindly patriotic conservatives. After all, accepting homelessness as a byproduct of our society in terms of drug addiction, lack of economic opportunity, lackluster mental health treatment options, a broken Veterans Administration, and such a weak social safety net that we let our poor die in public in the streets of the wealthiest cities in the country would require coming to terms with the greed, cruelty, and corruption that's run through the veins of this cursed land since the inception of the American experiment. It's much easier to blame the homeless and call them freeloading, lazy, ungrateful welfare dependents who ought to just fuck around and work harder, and to cast Democratic lawmakers as their enablers. Now moving to the post-fire leftist narrative, which seemed to suggest that these motherfucking celebrity colonizers shouldn't have built mansions on indigenous lands, which reinforces the Nebraskan misconception that all of us in LA are living like Ty Lopez, despite the fact that Hollywood, tech, and comedy have left California for tax breaks and a lower cost of living. Rest assured, we're gonna break down all of these narratives and misconceptions, but before we get into the meat and potatoes of the day, I'd like to present you all with some positive news as a reminder that shit is mostly okay if you turn off that damn phone. Our first positive story of the day is coming out of the mighty Philadelphia Zoo, where their 100-year-old critically endangered Galapagos tortoise who arrived at the zoo in 1932 is pregnant. A rapid DNA test recently confirmed that the zookeeper is thankfully not the father. That means this week, the first purebred Galapagos tortoise in 150 years will be born in West Philadelphia, thanks to the valiant efforts of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And apparently, it's a boy. So, cross your fingers, let's just hope that things go well, and he won't have to move across the country to live with his uncle in Bel Air. President of the Animal Wellbeing and Conservation Corps, Rachel Metz, is quoted as saying, "These hatchlings not only protect the species from extinction, but serve as important ambassadors to inspire guests who want to save wildlife and wild places," which frankly is inspiring news. The last time I was at the Philadelphia Zoo, I was 3 years old and petrified of the lions. But once these shelled bastards reach maturity, I'll be sure to stop by. And to all you zoo haters out there, I get it. But fragile and critically endangered species like the Galapagos tortoise don't stand a chance in animal sanctuaries. And that's on Joe Exotic. Free bro. I think. All right, moving on to some more positive news. In San Francisco, justice has been served. And no, I know what you're thinking. Jack the Bipper has not been arrested. But MAGA influencer and right-wing provocateur Richie Wynne, aka Richie415, a self-proclaimed San Francisco nationalist who I once interviewed back in the day for my piece San Francisco Streets, has been arrested for pimping, pandering, child endangerment, and is now being charged by the U.S. Attorney General's office for the production of child pornography, and is facing a minimum of 15 years in federal prison. Here's a look back at Richie and I's conversation.
My name's Richie Wynne. Basically, I'm kind of like a video vigilante, if you will. I'm kind of taking it into my own hands to film some of the things that I feel like are plaguing the city, mainly the drug use. Hey, bro, you know people got kids and stuff like that. You out here rolling up heroin or fentanyl. You can't be doing that right here. Have a little fucking respect, man, for people that pay rent. I don't think the children should have to see it because it's grotesque. A lot of it is, it's harsh to see. It is very gruesome. Some of these individuals are suffering from also mental illness and picking away at themselves. They are shooting drugs in their neck. They are screaming about obscenities that can be triggering to somebody that is frail and is still developing. I gotta stop smoking that shit in front of the kids, man. You got the kids right here, man. What the fuck you say, man? Arrest these individuals. Take them into custody.
While I believe the prison system to be generally a non-rehabilitative institution and more of a criminal networking opportunity than a corrective experience, this truly feels like poetic justice. If you can recall, Richie spent his afternoons gallivanting around the Tenderloin, antagonizing and filming homeless, drug-addicted people, typically chastising them with statements like, "Yo, pull your pants up, bro, you stink. Don't you know there's kids out here?"
What the fuck are you doing out here pregnant on dope on the streets, man? Get some help.
Hey, fuck you, you piece of shit.
This situation is unacceptable. It's disgusting to me to see a woman poisoning her baby like this on the streets.
A wise man once said that every accusation is a confession, which I'm not sure is true, but it sure is nice to see a bully who is converting public misery into capital through paid Fox News appearances and gaining clout by liaisoning YouTubers through the drug zones face the music for his own bad choices. In other happy news, I am hoping to officially partner with an organization called the Perception Restoration Foundation to help fund research to find a cure for hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, which is a lifelong condition that I've suffered from since I was 14 years old. The condition generally constitutes visual snow and frequent psychedelic flashbacks, often accompanying a variety of anxiety disorders like depersonalization and derealization. I've thankfully been able to live a normal life despite being perma-fried, but still, very little is known about the brain condition from a scientific standpoint, and I'd like to help change that. So stay tuned, and I'll keep you posted. All right, we're about to get into the fiery meat and potatoes of this episode, but before we get into it, a word. Hey, what's up, guys? Oh, shit. Hey, man, thanks for that web link. It's really working. I don't know if you guys missed the memo, but we just dropped an entire feature film. That's right, a full-blown movie at www.dearkellyfilm.com.
DearKellyFilm.com.
It's an action-packed movie that revolves around the life and times of Kelly Johnson, aka Kelly J. Patriot.
Kobe Bryant was assassinated by the Quins!
Come here, Nazi, you're going to Guantanamo.
Oh my gosh, what did I do? Am I getting canceled?
The Democrats don't like you, they're gonna cancel you.
It documents his semi-estranged family and their attempt to pull him out of the rabbit hole.
Are you selling baby parts, yes or no? Don't tread on me! Don't even think about it!
I don't want to say too much, but it's a good movie. If you guys want to watch it, it would mean a lot. www.dearkellyfilm.com. It's available for rent and buy. You can rent it for $5.55, or you can buy it for $15.55.
www.dearkellyfilm.com. www.dearkellyfilm.com. www.dearkelly.
All right, let's get into our next segment, the first ever in-the-field correspondence of the Channel 5 cast, which is a ride-along in the Angeles National Forest, which is near Mount Wilson, with Wildland Firefighter Union Representative Steve Gutierrez, who, much like Richard Nixon and Lefty Gunplay, is from the San Gabriel Valley. This footage, which I believe will set the stage well for the main interview of the segment today with journalist Danielle Venton, was gathered in the immediate aftermath of the Eaton fire as things began to calm down and the firefighters entered their cleanup stage. Here's a look at that footage.
Hi, I'm Steve Gutierrez. I'm a national business representative for National Federation of Federal Employees. I worked for the Forest Service for 15 years as a wildland firefighter. And we're going up here to Mount Wilson right now. There's a lot of resources there that are part of the fire. We'll see if we go talk to some Fed resources. Okay, Mount Wilson's like a very historical and important piece of infrastructure to LA. Millions of dollars are up here. I'm gonna say at least $1 billion now. All of the TV antennas, all of the radios, every 3-letter agency has their radio tower up here.
This looks like, Watts, California on steroids. Giant towers controlling the flow of information. It's kind of cool to think that we're, surrounded by an invisible field of so many frequencies.
So where I'm standing in these segments is exactly where the disastrous Eaton fire began. Given that presumably most of you guys don't live in LA, I'm gonna get a little bit nerdy and topographical here. So the Angeles National Forest is a massive 700,000 acre expanse behind the skyline of downtown that separates the gorgeous Mojave Desert from the population-dense LA basin. The Santa Monica Mountains, where the Palisades fire started, is a smaller, less grandiose, but equally flammable forest west of town, which encompasses Topanga, the Palisades, and Malibu. Now, while they're quite far from each other, what these forests have in common is that they're both maintained by federal firefighters who are employees of the National Park Service.
United States Forest Service. This is our jurisdiction here. Others will come up, of course, but this one, we had several fire engines up here that were, protecting during the initial firefight a couple days ago.
If you can tell, there was a bit of tension in the air back when we filmed this because it was their responsibility to extinguish both significant fires and they weren't able to.
It started mid-slope, above the city of Altadena. It's still under investigation. I'm sure the FBI is involved in all that.
In the immediate aftermath of the destruction, the firefighters primarily blamed 2 factors. The first factor they blamed is fuel management.
I think we can do better with fuel management.
The vegetation's at a critical state with fuel moisture.
In firefighter slang, fuel means flora.
All this stuff that you're looking at, all of the brush, all of the trees, that is what we consider as fuel. Trees in general, brush in general, that is fuel. The leaf litter that's on the ground there, that is fuel to add to the fire. So this fuel needs to be removed. It needs to be mulched. It needs to be burned in some way, shape, or form in some type of controlled manner, or turned into paper products, or, in this case, you could thin the forest. You can reduce the amount of trees that are around here so that they're not all competing for water, so that the canopy isn't touching each other, so the fire doesn't spread from tree to tree to tree.
To clarify, what Steve is referring to is not what would be considered deforestation, like what's happening in the Amazon rainforest or Indonesia, where habitats are bulldozed altogether to make room for residential developments and arable farmland.
No, it would be considered like timber harvesting, but not on a scale of clear cut. Where they just do massive blocks of clear cutting, right? They have to go out there, pick one tree, and pull that out. It's not, and here's the problem. It costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money.
The often expensive but beneficial brush clearing procedure Steve is referring to is called prescribed burning or controlled fire, a practice that was once used to manage the dry, highly flammable forests of Southern California, first by Native American tribes.
Yeah, Native Americans were some of the first to introduce fire into the landscape. They used it to herd buffalo, to herd and graze cattle. They've been doing it for thousands of years, and we've just eliminated that pretty much throughout the landscape. In other states, in rural states, it's a little bit easier. They have more of a relationship with fire. I know Florida specifically burns every year, and they have prescribed burning programs. I know in the Southwest, they definitely live with fire where they have prescribed fire burning programs. California does too.
Or at least they did. After conducting seasonal prescribed burns for decades, the U.S. Forest Service directed all of its California employees to indefinitely halt controlled fires on October 24, 2024, just 3.5 months before the massive wildfires took hold. The journalist who broke the story was Danielle Venton, who will break down exactly why the decision was made later in this video. However, with very little public transparency as to why the Forest Service made that call, an internal blame game ensued amongst firefighters, which you can see here. Steve seems to place blame on the voting public of the state, who he believes fundamentally misunderstand the practice.
The public needs to get on board when we start doing some prescribed fire burning. Do prescribed burning so that we have lower intensity fires when a wildfire does happen.
Putting that fire back into the ecosystem helps improve forest health and all of that.
But the public isn't in support of it because they don't want their homes smelling like smoke, you know?
Yeah.
So do you want your home smelling like smoke, or do you want a home at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just what it is. Having it all nice and picturesque isn't always the best.
Other firefighters blame environmental protection groups, who they claim have embedded themselves into local, state, and federal governments to push their snowflake, anti-burn, save the trees agenda at the expense of human life.
Mostly they don't understand the benefits of it for the most part. They don't want to put fire back onto the landscapes. They feel that it cannot be controlled. Their big concerns are obviously air pollution, at least here in the LA basin, and they put up a lot of roadblocks. There's a lot of endangered and threatened species that they want to protect. Animals, plant life, there's endangered plants.
Yeah.
But for most federal firefighters, the controlled burn blame game takes a real backseat to the bigger issue at hand, the battle for a fair wage.
Let's focus on the real issues.
The current pay for federal firefighters is $15 an hour starting.
Yeah, they start off at $15 an hour.
It's very hard to retain highly qualified candidates when they can make more in and out flipping cheeseburgers. The legislative action that we're pushing for the Wildland Firefighter Paycheck Protection Act through Congress has to get passed and placed into law so these firefighters can be compensated appropriately.
Definitely.
In the absence of a wage change between 2021 and 2024, during which California became the most expensive state in the country, while sporting both the highest personal income tax and homelessness rate, Steve says that many of his coworkers were forced to quit out of economic necessity.
In this region, specifically California, 45% of the workforce has left.
Here locally, about 40% we've lost to other agencies and other jobs just because the low pay and the schedule is so rigorous that we have to work to get that to a number to survive. You got to work 1,000 hours of overtime
To survive, to afford
to live in Southern California.
Right.
So 1,000 hours of overtime, and that's primarily from May to November.
Yeah.
So you're working a year and a half of hours in 6 months.
For most, voluntarily committing to that intensive a schedule for such little pay is out of the question, especially with the unique health and safety risks associated with the job.
Yeah, I mean, it's presumed that, wildland firefighters are going to get cancer. Smoke gets on our clothes, on our boots, on our pants. That all off-gasses into our bodies.
Extreme conditions faced by wildland urban interface firefighters are at a high risk of cancer.
You're out there dealing with the elements, right? You're waking up in the middle of the night to respond to a call. You're working thousands of hours of overtime. This stuff may be natural, but it's still carcinogen. It's still carbon that's going into your lungs. You're not wearing a respirator. You're not wearing any type of mask or anything like that.
It was for all of these reasons, from risk to pay to forest overgrowth, that the wildland firefighters found themselves ill-equipped to handle the situation as the fire spread beyond the forest and into the urban core, where LAFD, Cal Fire, and many others found themselves equally overpowered by the catastrophic blaze. Scrambling for help and faced with a diminished workforce as a result of their own greed, the state and feds opted to use their prison population to fill these empty jobs, which was convenient as they were allowed to pay inmates even less.
Of the roughly 1,870 firefighters that are out there, 900 of them are incarcerated. That's almost half.
Incarcerated firefighters get between $5 and $10 a day.
I've worked with incarcerated firefighters. They're tremendous workforce. They're great to work with. They're hard workers. They want to be there. They volunteer for that position. So every day that they work, they get 2 days off their sentence. That's a huge incentive. You work 100 days, you just got 200 off.
Yeah.
I do know that they get a certain low pay wage for per day, but
do you know what it is?
Honestly, it's a good avenue for them to gain some qualifications for a potential job lined up right afterward. Men and women do this. So for me, if I was incarcerated, I definitely would rather be out in the woods doing some work, occupying my time than spending myself in a jail cell.
How'd you feel hearing people say that DEI was to blame for the fires?
It's pretty sad to hear that kind of stuff out of some media outlets. I don't agree with it at all. I came from a hotshot crew that had 50% made of women. They pull their weight. They do a great job. That's BS. DEI has nothing to do with that. Everybody has their own weight to pull, and this job isn't made for everybody. A home is a home no matter what, and a firefighter is a firefighter no matter what, period. man or woman, doesn't matter.
All right, that was our segment. Now we're gonna get into the weeds with the first environmental journalist I've ever met in my life, Mrs. Danielle Venton, who covers wildfires, outer space, and oceans. She's currently working for KQED, a public radio station based out of San Francisco. Before working in California, she wrote about computing and computer science in Geneva, Switzerland, but switched gears as wildfires began to ravage her home state, particularly after the Camp Fire of 2017, where she was one of the first reporters on scene in the devastated locale of Paradise, California. Before getting into it, I just want to thank Danielle for showing up on such short notice. 24 hours prior, we got flaked on by a Wall Street Journal reporter named Jim Carlton, who discovered at the 11th hour that we were not, in fact, Channel 5 KTLA, but lowly mere Channel 5 with Andrew Callaghan. But fuck it. Fuck the Wall Street Journal. I prefer Miss Venton's work anyway, so I'm very glad she showed up to occupy Wall Street. Get it? Because it was supposed to be Wall Street Journal and she's occupying his chair. Anyways, months before this year's catastrophic fires, Danielle was raising awareness and writing foreboding articles about the federal government's decision to halt prescribed burns. And after the fires brought national attention, her words bled into the greater conservative outrage machine, allowing many to point fingers at a progressive government of communist tree huggers who'd rather save salamanders than human lives. But as we'll come to learn, the reality is much more complicated, but features nuggets of truth from both sides of the aisle. But before we get into it, a word from our sponsor. Here at the Channel 5 newsroom, we know more than most how unpredictable the world can be. On a day just like any other, you could be pulling into the office and boom, you're T-boned by a Ford F-150. Your car's totaled, your back's hurting, and you're gonna be late for work. While this might sound unrealistic, it actually isn't, like at all. 2 million people in the United States are injured every year. Are you prepared for that possibility? Well, guess what? If you're injured in a car accident, your case could be worth millions. But most people never file a claim, and if they do, they're often lowballed by insurance companies into thinking it's not worth their time. How could millions not be worth your time? It's ridiculous. Traditional injury law firms might bog you down with reams of paperwork, time-consuming processes, never-ending upcoming appointments, and the cost that accompany all those things. But not Morgan & Morgan. Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm with over 1,000 attorneys operating in all 50 states, even Rhode Island. They're not one of these traditional law firms who might waste your time and money. They're a national-facing brand with a promise of being for the people, para la gente. Morgan & Morgan do not settle for lowball offers. They've achieved significant verdicts in the past couple of months for victims involved in life-altering car crashes. Morgan & Morgan was able to secure one client $6.3 million, despite the client's own insurance company arguing they deserve nothing. Despite prior medical issues and minimal vehicle damage, Morgan & Morgan was able to build a compelling case and reward what was rightly deserved. In Florida, they secured $12 million, which was 34 times the highest insurance offer. And in Philadelphia, they were able to even secure $26 million, 40 times the highest insurance offer. You might be thinking, I don't have the money to hire lawyers in a case that might go on for a while. But that's the thing, their fee is absolutely free unless you win. Fighting big insurance companies takes a big law firm, which is why America's largest injury firm can take on companies of any size. It only takes a few minutes to see if you could have a case, and it couldn't be easier to submit a claim. If you ever seriously got injured, your case could be worth millions, and you're only a few clicks away from your potentially life-changing sum of money. It's so easy. You can start your claim right now with Morgan & Morgan at www.forthepeople.com/channel5, found in the description or by scanning the QR code on this screen from your phone's camera. All right, guys, thanks. In this interview, we're going to discuss why the burn program was halted, what other contributing factors led to the catastrophe, and most importantly, how the people of Los Angeles can adequately prepare themselves for the next round. Without further ado, here's the interview. Danielle, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate you coming down to our studio. I'm really excited to talk about all the things related to the prescribed burns in the LA wildfires.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So there's been a lot of discourse surrounding California's decision to stop the prescribed burn program. And whenever there was a lot of discourse about that after the, obviously, wildfire disaster broke out, a lot of people pointed to an article that you wrote months before the big fires, kind of criticizing their decision to halt the program.
The article that you're referring to was about the federal government, the Forest Service, halting its prescribed burns. What was so interesting about that was that the feds were saying no more prescribed burning until further notice. But everyone else, state agencies, local prescribed burn associations, tribes were doing great burning at that time. It was a really good burn window in a lot of the state. So that was why some of my sources were critical of the federal government for halting that burning. So it wasn't like a California-based thing. It was a federal government decision. That said, the history of prescribed burning really has its roots in practices of Native people who, for thousands and thousands of years, cared for their land primarily through fire. They burned not necessarily to try to prevent bad fires, but to open up hunting ground, to encourage acorn harvests, to get the bugs out of an area. And they did get fire protection along with that. When white settlers came to the Western U.S., they didn't understand that practice and thought it was dangerous and outlawed it and even threatened Native people with death if they were caught burning. In the early part of last century, the emphasis was on growing and on timber harvest, and people thought that by not having fire, you were protecting trees. The habit of intentionally setting good fire went by the wayside. Didn't take too many decades for a lot of scientists to realize that we do need good fire. There's no world where we don't have fire. We just kind of choose the fires that we want. There's been, in the last couple decades, this reblossoming of interest in good fire. There's areas of the states where it never stopped. The southeastern U.S., Florida, all of that southern belt have had a robust, good fire culture for many decades. But in California, we're really seeing a resurgence of it.
So when you talk about colonization, obviously the colonization of California took a couple different centuries. The first people to arrive were the Spanish, who set up missions in Santa Barbara, San Jose, Santa Cruz. And then obviously it became an American territory later in time. Were prescribed burns outlawed or punished by the colonial entities during that early period of colonization, or did that come when westward expansion was in full spring?
It was more when miners and ranchers were moving in.
Got you. So it was during westward expansion when you saw a lot of the industry headed to the West Coast to make money from logging and timber, which is why Portland and Seattle became such major trade hubs. And so the idea was that if the Native Americans were to burn the forests to open up fertile ground for hunting, acorn harvest, etc., that would make it so there's less money to be made in terms of trees to cut down.
And it was a hard thing to understand, right? Like there's not a good fire system in England or in Scotland because it's such a wet climate. But Native people understood that to take care of land in the Western U.S., you did need to set periodic fire. And early settlers who wrote accounts about visiting this area talk about how, the forests were just these beautiful park-like habitats where you could kind of walk through with your arms outstretched and not touch anything. And there was always a light haze in the sky from the burning that was happening. That park-like habitat, was because of intentional fire, because fire was allowed to pass through.
Were there huge wildfires back then, before colonization?
I mean, fires did happen from lightning strikes, but they weren't this kind of intense. What we are seeing now is very new, where you have 100,000 acres burned at incredibly high intensity. 200 years ago, fires moved through more frequently, but they were less intense and they didn't kill as many, big trees.
So, long story short, in your perspective, what caused the LA wildfires?
A century plus of doing things in a fire antagonistic way. So the LA fires had several causes. One big one was the weather. There were 90-mile-an-hour winds. It was the equivalent of a Category 5 hurricane for fire. We also have communities that are not built with fire in mind. And then we are also seeing the fingerprint of climate change in those fires, because it was the winter rains, which should have come, didn't come. There was, 8 months without a drop of rain. And the season before had been so wet. So there was all of this luscious growth, and then it was super dry. And so there was all of this fuel to burn. So you just had factors stacking up. that brought these horrible, horrible fires to the area.
And to clarify, the Southern California habitat is a bit different from other parts of the state because you have the desert that's over the valley, and then the Northern California ecosystem is not what is considered chaparral. And what can you tell us about the difference between a typical California forest and the Southern California habitat?
Yeah. So the dominant story of fire in most of California and most of the West is that there has not been enough fire. The frequency with which fire is moving through is taking longer than it would have 200 years ago before Western settlement. Southern California is a really different story where we're seeing too much fire in this area rather than not enough. And you mentioned chaparral. That's this, beautiful, biodiverse, scrubby habitat that is in this area that has plants like manzanita and sagebrush and chamise. And that is not meant to burn as frequently as it has been burning. I was looking up some stats, and the land above Malibu Canyon historically would have burned every 30 to 100 years, and their fire, that land is fire adapted to some extent. Fire could move through, and then those plants could reestablish. Well, now fire is moving through these areas on the average about every 8 years, and that's not enough time for that vegetation that's kind of supposed to be there to reestablish. And so what we're seeing is non-native grasses that are really flammable moving in, and it's just accelerating this pattern. Most of the state has a story of not enough fire, but this area of Southern California has too much fire.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the absence of prescribed burns happening in federal forests around the LA area contributed to the disaster that took place?
I'm a big fan of prescribed fire. And there are instances where the forests in and around Los Angeles have been treated with prescribed fire that helped save communities when there was a subsequent wildfire. I'm thinking of Angeles Oaks. Mm-hmm. However, I do not blame the lack of prescribed fire on the devastation that we saw a couple months ago in LA.
Mm-hmm. But you did call the situation a mega policy failure. So what are the main policies that you think caused the disaster?
Yeah, the idea that mega fires are a policy failure has organized a lot of my reporting over the last few years. And that's because we did not used to have this problem with fire. It's the result of human choices, but that's choices over decades, right? So it started with outlawing cultural burning and continued with suppressing all fires. The Forest Service used to have a policy that it wanted all forest fires to be out by 10 a.m. the next day. Mm-hmm. You have to go through a ton of red tape or green tape to do a prescribed fire. That's held a lot of prescribed fires back. And then the way we build houses, they're the most flammable thing in the landscape in many cases. You can see an area where fires move through and the trees may still be green, but the house will be burned down. So we need policies to be pro-fire rather than fighting fire. Sometimes I think about fire used to be humans' best friend, right? And now it's our worst enemy.
Now dogs are best friend.
I do love dogs. But we can do things to be less antagonistic to fire. It doesn't need to be a pitched battle where we're just, there's an arms race. We can work with it.
How?
Through a million different things. So you should just expect that fire is going to show up and try to be ready for it when it does. You can make sure that your house is resistant to embers. Up to 90% of homes that burn are not burning down from the advancing front of flames. They're burning down because embers are being catapulted by wind and they find a way into an attic, say, and then burn it down. Well, you can prevent those embers from getting in by just putting a fine mesh over your attic vents. A lot of people have a wood fence that leads straight to the house. Well, if a fire is in the area, that can act like a candle wick, straight to the house. So there's a lot of things we can do with home hardening. There's a lot of things we can do with creating a strategic fuel break, which might not stop the fire, but would be a place where firefighters could have an access point and take a stand. I think we need to hugely ramp up our prescribed fire. We also eventually need to think about maybe managed fire, which are you familiar with that? So Managed fire sometimes is called like let it burn, which is a term a lot of people hate, but it kind of gets at it.
Sounds very destructive.
It sounds
chaotic.
super destructive and sounds really, accident prone and uncontrolled. But prescribed fires are so hard to do that when you look at the fire debt in California, like the fire that we need, it's going to be really hard to treat all those acres with prescribed fire. Ideally, we would be treating about 1 million acres a year. 200 years ago, about 4 million acres a year burned in the state. So we can barely get to like 100,000, with like all of the agencies working together. Some people think that what we need to do is when a fire naturally breaks out and it's burning kind of in a medium style way and it's not doing too much damage and it's kind of acting like a prescribed fire, that you just let it continue to burn until you find a place where you can put it out. That would be appropriate in like a very sparsely very sparsely populated area, not in LA at all.
Yeah.
But that's something that kind of no one really wants to talk about managed fire because it just sounds so scary.
Yeah.
But it might be one of the tools that would help us get to a more fire-safe future.
One thing that you mentioned about the process of getting approval for prescribed burns is you said there's a lot of yellow tape and red tape that you have to navigate.
And green tape.
Yeah, and green tape. Can you kind of give us a magnifying glass into that bureaucracy? Like, what are the bodies of approval? What does that process look like if I'm a firefighter and I want to get approval to do a prescribed burn in somewhere like the Angeles National Forest?
I'm not a burn boss. I've never written a burn plan. But let's say you were a burn boss and you wanted to do a prescribed fire.
Is this a real title?
It's the real title.
Okay, thank you.
That's
Cool.
like the coolest job.
It's not like fire journalist slang.
No.
Gotcha.
Like you are a burn boss. So you write a burn plan, and what's interesting is the reason it's called a prescribed fire is you write a prescription for the fire. The prescription might be, I want to kill all the trees that are 1 inch in diameter and smaller. That's how specific they get. Depending on what land you are, you have to get CEQA approval, which is California Environmental Quality Act, or if it's on federal land, you need to get your NEPA approval, National Environmental Policy Act. You have to get, like 1 billion people to sign off on it. You have to have like backup there in case the fire got out of control so that you could suppress it. And people are very hesitant to assign resources to a prescribed fire if they're worried a fire might break out some other place. That's why last fall, the Forest Service halted all prescribed burning because they thought that maybe their firefighters would be needed somewhere else. And I remember one of the prescribed burns that I was on in the Six Rivers National Forest, which is like along the Klamath River. There was this really neat guy, and he was so happy to be burning. And I said, how long have you been planning this burn? And he said, like 7 years. I was like, that is just insane. And how are we ever going to treat all of this land with fire if it takes 7 years to get a project done?
So there's an unbelievably annoying process of administrative bureaucracy that you have to go through to even get approval to be able to do that.
On federal land, yes. If you are a private landowner, you still have to get like a burn permit.
Yeah.
But it's much easier.
Yeah, you can set your own house on fire. It's yours.
No, I don't think you can.
Why not? I mean, you bought it.
Because I think it would be causing too much of a hazard to your neighbors.
Oh, that's true. But if you lived out in the middle of nowhere and weren't trying to run an insurance scam, you'd be, that'd be within your rights, right?
I assume so.
Yeah. So the prescribed burn process is kind of like the asylum application process. Like it takes like 7-8 years.
It's pretty bad.
It's unbelievably mismanaged. You mentioned these specific boards, the Environmental Protection Board, you said?
Oh, no, different acts. So they're pieces of law that are, trying to make sure that we don't repeat the environmental mistakes of the past.
Are there any sort of like extreme tree hugger types who are involved in this process who just think all fire is bad because they want to save every living animal?
Well, I will tell you that everybody who I speak to regularly, who is a trusted source, think that like CEQA and NEPA, these acts and the process that you have to go through are flawed and could be helpfully tweaked. People fight over details, right? There are, it seems to me, some green groups that just don't want kind of humans doing much of anything on the landscape. Don't light prescribed fires, don't cut down any trees in the name of fire safety. Some think that very intense fires are ecologically good. I don't want to point fingers at people, because I think a lot of environmental organizations are well-intentioned, but there are some that just seem to be sort of lawsuit cannons and hold up a lot of work that would otherwise happen on federal land.
That's a big problem.
It is. However, it is not an overwhelming problem. And I think if you talk to people who care about prescribed fire, few of them would say that the biggest hurdle in their way is environmental lawsuits, because there is a process to move it through.
So after the fire broke out, there was obviously a huge amount of frustration aimed at eco-bureaucrats. There was a New York Post article that was blaming an environmental protection group that's out of Topanga, who's dedicated to the preservation of an endangered shrub, and vetoed a bunch of different prescribed fire burnings that the federal firefighters wanted to do in the Santa Monica Mountains.
I don't think they vetoed it. I think they sued to stop it, right? And then.
Well, yeah, sorry I missed up the language, but they effectively stopped it from happening. And so there's a big perception that, these people care more about an endangered shrub than the lives and homes of hundreds of thousands of people.
That's not a one-to-one decision, right? I think if you're talking about, there was a plan to replace old wood electrical infrastructure with steel ones. The fire in that area didn't start. It's not suspected to have started from, wooden poles or electrical lines. It seems like maybe a fire that had been started from New Year's Day fireworks, or New Year's Eve fireworks, flared up again. That blame may be misplaced.
Do you think that it's part of a broader, anti-environmentalist, pro-drilling movement that's trying to trivialize the concerns of people who are concerned about climate change and just make it seem like they're all just these delusional lunatics who care more about the environment than human life?
I mean, I think these fires were kind of an unbelievable moment for people trying to score political points and, just expressing kind of radical thoughts, and everyone overnight becoming a fire safety expert, and stuff that was never controversial before becoming kind of controversial overnight.
Yeah.
Stuff that I had written, I felt like it was misapplied because it fit in with people who wanted to score a point against whoever they didn't like. The campfire that destroyed Paradise.
In 2017.
In 2017, I hadn't really seen such a political lightning rod come from from an instance of fires.
You're in a unique position there where you create something that is, somewhat critical of a progressive movement in a certain capacity, and then there's a right-wing, canon event that creates a whole propaganda cycle for them, and all of a sudden elements of your research are being cherry-picked to advance their narrative, and you've kind of fallen into the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
What was the main piece of research that you feel like got hijacked by that crowd?
I am happy to criticize any fire agency, federal or state, no matter who is at the head of it, if they are, kind of messing up on their duty to try to promote healthy forests and healthy ecosystems. And the piece that I did that at least echoed other people's criticisms of the Forest Service for kind of being so afraid to do prescribed fire and, in their view, refusing to take a leadership role in this, then got grasped onto and said, hey, look, it's these people's fault, when that wasn't paying attention to the context of which, in which these fires broke out.
Yeah. I mean, the way they put it, it was kind of a hybrid theory, but what I gathered was they thought that the fire was started by homeless people on Skid Row who got butane lighters from harm reduction facilities. They started a trash fire, and then the DEI firefighters show up, just kind of throw their hands in the air. They're like, we don't know what to do. Let's tweet about this. And then it spreads, and then the space lasers make it even worse.
Yeah.
And then there was leftist discourse that was something, I saw it on Twitter, that was like, these celebrities should know better than building mansions on occupied Tongva land. And there was a weird notion that everyone living in LA was like this massive celebrity. And I'm over here in Altadena, and I'm like, damn, you guys got it all wrong.
Yeah. Do you live in Altadena?
No, I was just over there covering the fires.
Oh, okay.
Which kind of brings me to a different point that I had, is one thing that Steve Gutierrez said, who's a wildland firefighter, is he said that the public needs to get on board when we start doing some prescribed fire burnings. What role does the public, not the boards that do administrative approval, but what role does the public, the tax-paying voting population, play in the approval of these fires?
the public is important because they kind of are surrounding the decisions that people make. You know, if people in power are making really unpopular decisions, sometimes they don't keep their job very long. And I would say 10 years ago or so, members of the public were very afraid of prescribed fire. They thought that it would be, you know, maybe it would escape, and there have been escapes. So it's not like that never happens. Or they don't want any smoke in the air. You know, they don't sign off on a burn plan. But what the public wants, you know, agencies do gather public input. So it makes a difference if people want prescribed fire or not. I was mentioning other areas of the nation where there's more prescribed fire, you know, it makes a difference if your neighbors want you to light the land on fire, right?
So public opinion is important, but there's no explicit vote where like the people of the Palisades got to decide yes or no to prescribed burns?
No, I don't think there's not a vote, but they can make it unpleasant for people who do want to do that fire.
Yeah.
You know, they can levy lawsuits or, you know, what I would also say the public needs to get on board with is the idea of communities being ready for fire. And that is kind of a much more personal, maybe much more difficult thing, because getting communities ready for fire looks like getting rid of that tree that you love or, you know, taking out some shrubs that give you some extra privacy. And I think that's going to be really hard for people. We're seeing California looking at a law that would require within 5 feet out from your house, there can be nothing burnable. And scientists believe that would go a huge way towards saving more houses. But I think emotionally it's going to be really difficult for people. But if people bought into that idea of getting your house and your whole neighborhood ready for fire, we would see a lot less destruction.
Does that mean like no rocking chair?
A wooden rocking chair would be a risk.
It's not gonna work for retirees.
We'll have to see
they
how
love
it goes,
them. I like
right?
them too. I just don't have one.
Yeah.
So speaking of the public, and we're not going to bash on the wealthy here, but there is the lure and mystique of being successful and rich in Los Angeles is buying a house in the hills. The hills are actually just the mountains, and the mountains are made of the most flammable fuel in the state. So do you think that there's any undoing this perception that wealth in Los Angeles connotates this sort of like serene, in the hills but near the city thing? Are we just going to have to eventually do away with that?
Oh, I don't know. Can people live in the hills safely?
Yeah.
Is that the idea? I think there could be ways for people to live in the hills safely. When we talk about like, does there need to be undoing of, you know, wealthy people's lifestyles? I don't know. I'm not real thrilled with the amount of like income inequity that we see. It's a different issue from fire though.
Well, okay, so if you look at Mexico, Rio de Janeiro, other developing nations, hills are associated with poverty. You know, that's where they build slums, favelas, shanty towns. That's a place where it's harder to get to. It's obviously difficult for older people to come back and forth. So the cheapest part of any city outside of the US, mostly in Europe, is the hills. But because the US has such wealth and equity, the hills have become more expensive because the rich want to be isolated from the poor, not have to witness the sort of frustration that comes with, you know, a Lamborghini next to a homeless encampment.
You know, I never thought about that before. My grandparents bought land in Novato, which is like in northern Marin. And there was this like new subdivision going in, and then there was this like little pimple of a hill. And it was the eyesore. You know, everyone wanted to live in the valley. This is like in the 50s. And they were going to just bulldoze it down. And my grandfather was like, well, I'll buy that. You know, and it turned out to be like a really desirable house in the neighborhood. But maybe that's part of like a country's economic stages where hills go from being, I'd never thought of that before.
Not only that, but also LA has done so much to destroy public transit and incentivize car ownership and freeways. The whole city is based upon the idea of total isolation of the poor and rich. You don't see those fault lines meet anywhere except for Larchmont and East Hollywood. That's the only fault line I can think of where you have concentrated wealth on a direct flat plane next to people kind of living in the projects.
Well, that's one of the sad things about Altadena being so hard hit, from what I understand, was that it was a place where you could have real working class families, you know, of all stripes mixing.
Definitely.
Good coffee.
It is good, right? We used to do Starbucks blend. This is going to make the podcast. We used to have Starbucks blend, and we switched over from Pike Place roast to a local, not local, but some Hawaiian blend, I believe. So shout out to our office assistant, Julia, for holding it down. She lives in Lancaster, so she doesn't have to worry about fires. Sorry, Julia. I just don't know why she lives there. It's crazy. You know, it's so far away, but, you know, some people like the desert vibe.
You know, people seem split on the idea of whether there might be areas that are too dangerous to live in. Some people seem to think, yeah, there's just like, you know, shouldn't build in a floodplain. You shouldn't build in a fire shed where fire comes through every so often. And other people seem to think, well, you know, we can do so much to divert fire or, you know, harden a home that you should be able to live there. It's like, it's one of those things that there's not a lot of consensus on. There's so many things in the fire world that there's a huge amount of consensus on. And like, are there areas that are too dangerous to live? Some people think so, yes. Some people think so, no. There's definitely areas of Sonoma County that I would not want to live in because they're on real steep hills, like dense vegetation.
You live there now?
I live in Sonoma County, but I don't live in a real fire-prone area. Like if my house burns, basically the apocalypse has come.
What's the largest city in Sonoma County?
Santa Rosa.
Oh, Santa Rosa is there.
Yeah. So we've been hit by like the 2017 fires that like took out Coffee Park. I mean, that was just, that was insane. But these are all, you know, all these really bad fires we're talking about are associated with super high winds, super dry weather, super hot, super dry, super high winds.
Yeah.
And you were talking about people being really interested in like exactly how the spark started. That's worth paying attention to. It's always worth investigating how your fire started. Do you have a guess for how many fires CAL FIRE has responded to this year?
39.
610.
Serious L for me there.
610 wildfires just this year. Last year, it was more than 8,000. So fires are starting all the fucking time, right?
Yeah.
And we only really care about the ones that take people's lives and burn down houses. I understand that.
Yeah.
But what that tells me is that they're always gonna be starting. So it's much better to like be ready for one to start and kind of be able to deal with that rather than thinking that we can stop every ignition.
Right. So it's about preparing for fire. And then, as you mentioned, the prescribed burn approval process is a bureaucratic nightmare, but it's not the sole driving cause of these recurring wildfires.
Agreed.
But it's not helpful.
No, it would be better for it to be easier to, you know, right now we treat prescribed fire as it's like this optional extra thing that is not necessary. If you're a burn boss and your burn gets out of control, you're liable for that. You burn down my house, you owe me a new house.
You can't just quit and blame your company?
If you work for an agency, like, you know, your agency will cover that liability. Yeah. I think there's one burn boss in California. Last time I looked into this, there was like one burn boss in California who could get insurance, private insurance. So you're going to be really cautious before you do that.
Yeah.
Right? You're going to make sure you have all your ducks in a row. If a wildfire starts, no one's liable for, you know, unless you started it, you're not liable for that if it burns down your house.
Yeah.
If it burns down my house, like, you know, I can't necessarily sue anyone because it was a wildfire.
But I feel like every catastrophe, everyone becomes polarized to try to point singular blame at a cause. And as a journalist, your goal is to say multiple things can be true at one time. Here's the order of importance and magnitude. And so number one, you're saying is the winds, the Santa Ana winds. Number two, would you say climate change?
I don't know the percentages. I don't know if I can like confidently rank them. But for these fires, I would say winds, I would say built environment, climate change, and then, yeah.
Non-white firefighters.
Yeah, DEI, no.
The funniest thing
DEI is not causing fires.
One thing that I thought was crazy is like when all the conservative reactionaries were doing the whole DEI thing, they were using AI imagery of like these heroic white firefighters, and then all the AI imagery of the DEI firefighters were like literally 5'7", like racially ambiguous people with glasses and like no muscle definition. I was like, have you guys seen firefighters before?
Yeah.
First of all, they're not all white, but they're all pretty strong.
They are. And let's talk about DEI for a second. We are going to need so many more firefighters in the future and so many more people to do prescribed burns and create fire breaks and all that clearing, right? And the pipeline is like, some people are worried that the pipeline is not necessarily there. There's this really neat program in Marin. It's a hotbed of liberalism and all that. But as a really, really neat fire chief who's created a program called Fire Forward that offers encouragement to women and to minority firefighters to bring them in, give them training, because it's not necessarily easy to become a firefighter. Most firefighters have one in the family to help them figure out how to get in there.
Yeah.
And they're trying to train the next generation of firefighters because it's a pretty good job. It's an established way into the middle class. So you could try to solve poverty while also making sure that you have firefighters in the future. The other thing that, I don't know if I did a piece about the Shaver Lake area fires, and I was kind of interested in the public is so amped up on the idea that firefighters are heroes, and they risk their personal safety, to protect others. That is heroic, but they are also professionals who should be respected and who should be paid well and who should not have to put themselves at undue risk to protect my house. And they're so valorized after a fire, but they're not necessarily appreciated when they're doing a defensible space inspection and give you you have to clear this stuff, and people are like, fuck you. Yeah. So it's not really helpful, I think, for people to get wrapped up in this idea of the heroism of firefighters. Yeah. So we could treat them better.
Yeah, I've been indoctrinated since a young person in the heroic narrative of firefighters, ranging from, Clifford the Big Red Dog to this moment right now, where when I think firefighter, I picture a man jumping out of a helicopter into the gates of hell with a bunch of flame retardant strapped to his back.
Right, but if that was you, wouldn't you rather that forest be cared for well, and so that you didn't have to do that? You didn't have to put your life at risk? Yeah. I think we could treat our firefighters better.
How are we going to do that?
Well, we should pay them properly. We should take preventing fires as seriously as putting them out. And we should, not expect that they risk their life to save our property.
Yeah, you mentioned something really important, which is the pay and the risk. So going back to the wildland firefighters who obviously work for the National Park Service, they drive green trucks, they're a little bit different. But they're oftentimes on the front lines when fires first start. So especially in California, it's seen as their responsibility to stop the fire from advancing from the forest into the population centers. So for the past 10 years, they've been getting paid a non-negotiable wage of $15 an hour, which is less than you make working as a manager at In-N-Out Burger. So they've lost 50% of their workforce since COVID because of the rising cost of living in California. A lot of them love the job and they want to help people and take care of the forest, but they can't afford to live in California under these circumstances while working as a firefighter and getting paid $15 an hour. So they've lost so much of their workforce, and they were campaigning for the past couple of years under the Biden administration, pay us more. Now Trump's in office and he's threatening to cut the whole force as it's currently composed in half. So what is the path forward as far as getting firefighters a fair wage?
There was a firefighter fix program that was proposed, I think, last year. And it was with the Inflation Reduction Act, money got temporarily funded, and then it was also funded in the continuing resolution. Congress knows that's a problem and is trying to fix that. A lot of firefighters are exempt from the buyouts and the layoffs so far, but a lot of the people who do research and the scientists that support them, you need scientists to study an area before you light it on fire for a prescribed burn or before you create a fire break. Those are the people getting laid off, and so it's going to be harder to do that advanced work, which will mean even more focus on suppression, which is a negative cycle.
So what threat does the new Trump administration pose for the future of wildfires?
Right now, it seems like there's a lot of short-term thinking going on with how the Forest Service works and how wildlands are cared for. And a lot of the interest seems to be towards extracting resources, increasing logging, and doing less of the advanced prep work. We'll have to see how it shakes out. It feels like it changes by the hour.
So going back to your career, I think that your journey has been pretty interesting, going from covering computer-related stuff to now becoming a fire journalist.
Mm-hmm.
What was that launch point for you?
It was partially because of where I lived. So I thought when I grew up, I thought I'd become a scientist. And I don't really like doing science. I don't like gathering data, but I like talking about it and thinking about it. Mm-hmm. So was, starting my career as a science journalist. And then I live in Northern California. I'm, for the Bay Area, I live quite far north. And so I was closest to the fires. So the radio station would send me first. Mm. And then started seeing patterns, getting interested in how kind of all fires are the same, but every fire has something that's unique about it. And then I was off to the races, I guess. It feels like I have a lot of job security with how bad fires are getting.
Yeah, that's how I feel with the country getting worse.
Yeah. Well, I would love to be out of a job for that.
It's always sad as a journalist. You're like, man, things are really bad right now. Mm-hmm. Man, I'm going to have some good content to work with.
Yeah. And you're like, oh man, it's getting even worse.
Mm-hmm. What's the most destructive fire that you've personally witnessed in the field?
I went to Paradise, in the aftermath of that. And that felt unthinkable at the time. Mm-hmm. I also drove through Altadena and Pacific Palisades after the fires, and I just couldn't believe it. I mean, it was, normally you see couple hundred fire engines and stuff, but driving along the Pacific Coast Highway, there was just thousands of trucks from every part of
When I spoke to people that had their homes burned down, obviously when someone's in that tense moment, they're not necessarily speaking in a way that they would otherwise speak. But a lot of people were upset that there wasn't any firefighters on scene. Was there a firefighter shortage at that time?
Firefighting resources got overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. But when we see these big mega fires that turn into urban conflagrations where mm-hmm. the fuel is actually houses, not the forest, right? Or the chaparral. The fuel is the houses. You cannot pay for enough firefighters in the world. And even if everybody was a firefighter, some of these fires don't respond to firefighting. Mm-hmm. The water evaporates before it can get to the flames. You can't fly planes because the winds are so intense. What firefighters are doing, they can't engage directly with the fire. So of course it's upsetting when you want to see a fire engine outside your house and you don't. But it is also true that, we cannot get enough resources to cover everything at once. And we have this mutual aid system. There was a lot of people who flowed into the area. Most people don't think we can one more hand crew our way out of this problem. Mm-hmm. It's like actually attacking the root cause of these mega fires.
Mm-hmm. Are you optimistic about the future?
Oh, I don't know. I would like to be. There is a better world out there that we could move towards where we have a better relationship with fire. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are interested in it. 10 years ago when I started doing this, people didn't really want to hear about fires outside of the fire season. The fact that we're having this conversation now gives me some hope that people will think and learn more about fires and start trying to think about how to live with them and not just, rely on firefighters to bail us out when the flames are coming towards us.
Maybe this disaster was God's way of keeping the question alive.
Maybe. It's good to use disasters to kind of reevaluate how we're doing things.
That's kind of the jump off point for every big conversation is something bad happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. The Titanic, ushered in new shipping safety regulations kind of overnight. And we fortunately don't see those kind of disasters anymore. I really hope that we use this moment to think about how to better live with fires. Mm-hmm. That would be the best outcome.
And I hope that it doesn't escape public consciousness when the next thing comes along. Because if you look at the last big, hard conversations that people had, it's like police brutality in 2020. Mm-hmm. A couple years later, the Middle Eastern conflict breaks out. that conversation disappears into obscurity.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the worry is, maybe there's a hurricane next year or a tornado and people stop talking about fires.
Well, I'll keep talking about fires. So
That's good. I'm never going to stop talking about fires.
Excellent.
So if somebody wants to find your work, where can they keep up with you?
So I work for KQED, which is an NPR member station.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on Blue Sky, sometimes still on Twitter or X. But if you go to the KQED's website or just Google me, I'm super easy to find.
Is Blue Sky like Twitter, but less like Nazis and whatnot?
Is
that what it is?
Yeah.
Everyone says you got to get on Blue Sky, but I went on there and I'm like, where's the diversity?
That is my problem with Blue Sky. I felt like there was a while where Twitter did seem like kind of the commons. You could get a diversity of opinions, and Blue Sky right now feels like kind of a lot of people just, kind of echo chamber.
They need some DEI.
They do.
But to include include conservative reactionaries for the court of public opinion.
They could sign up.
Yeah, Blue Sky is kind of the answer to like Rumble and a lot of these alternative conservative platforms that emerged during the great censorship of 2020.
What do you use?
I just use YouTube and Instagram. I'm traditional.
Okay.
I feel like a 1800s Quaker, because everyone's like, have you been on TikTok and Blue Sky? I'm just like, I stick to my morals, but I'm not hating on you for going on Blue Sky. I'm going to make a Blue Sky account, but I don't go on X or Twitter because it's so negative. And Liam, our producer, goes on Twitter all the time, which is important for our business because he gets informed about these cultural happenings.
Yeah.
But I stick on the Instagram.
Oh my God. I mean, X has changed so much. Like, it used to be a really supportive fireplace. There used to be like a great fire Twitter, and I still have people who tweet there now, so I'm like, I can't quite leave it. But I was doing some reporting after the layoffs of like all of the probationary federal workers, and like interested in how it was going to impact fire safety programs. And like, I got bullied by people.
What were they saying to you?
That I was like an opportunist, and that I only cared about prescribed fire because Trump was in office. And I was like, I have been doing this for years.
Yeah, it's certifiably not true.
Yeah.
That's not cool. How do you deal with cyberbullying?
I engaged with each and every person actually, and sent them links of like,
damn.
Yeah.
No wonder you're on Blue Sky. You can't feed the trolls; they'll just come back 10 times harder.
No one said like, "Oh, Danielle, you're right. I was unfair," but they did stop. Like, it was like kind of metastasizing, and I stopped the metastasizing.
That's good. You stopped the bleeding before it got out of control.
Yeah.
Do you cover any water-related stuff, or mostly just fire?
Sometimes. I spent a year trying to cover water stuff, and it's so complicated. Like, have you ever tried to do a fish story?
I'm doing one right now on the Salton Sea.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, but it's so complicated. It's mostly about how the farmers in Imperial Valley are being, they're being disincentivized by the state of California to sell all of their water to San Diego and in LA because there's a water shortage here, which is causing the saline levels of the Salton Sea to go up. And it's also causing the water level to go down, which is releasing this toxic silt that's ancient from the floor of the Salton Sea. Now they have an asthma rate that is 6 times higher than national average. So if you go there, there's not a bird in the sky, there's not a fish in the water, and everyone's coughing up a lung. But it's cool. It's very post-apocalyptic Mojave vibes. I wanted to move there, but then after 2 or 3 days of living in my RV outside of a bar called the Ski Inn, I could barely breathe.
Oh my God. Are there good solutions to that? Like, the nice thing about fire is like there are good solutions. Like, there's a workable way to do it. Is there
a way to
solve this?
It would be the process of desalination, which is an extremely expensive procedure that would have to remove the salt content from the entire Salton Sea.
Like mechanically?
Reprocess it, bring fish back into the environment, fix the Colorado River problem to get fresh water back into the Salton Sea. And then the problem is the land is so non-valuable that there's no incentive, but on cash, if you have more money, the government cares more about your property.
Yeah, that's true.
Of course. Yeah. And the Salton Sea, because it's historically been so neglected, some of those communities like Slab City and Bombay Beach, the state of California is not concerned with protecting the Imperial Valley and Imperial County air. Right. There's so much more they have on their plate. I mean, they can barely figure out the Palisades. Right. Can you imagine they want to go to this lawless Mojave desert town and try to desalinate this dead lake bed? It's not going to happen.
Is the Salton Sea man-made or is it? Okay.
It's crazy. It was actually a result of error. They were trying to divert the Colorado River to be able to bring fresh water to LA and San Diego in the 1930s. And there was a guy, I don't know if he was drunk at work or something, but a dam collapsed that he made, and he was like, oh, he's alive, or he lived for a long time in shame. And all of that water filled up a dry lake bed that was only full during the time of dinosaurs. And it just kind of was there for a long time. They created a small resort town called Bombay Beach that lasted for about 30 or 40 years. And then because there was no fresh water coming back into it, all the fish started dying. So there was these mass die-offs of fish. We're talking thousands of fish would wash up on the shores, and it smelled so bad, like 1,000 dead fish. So everybody moved out, and then the LA Times came and wrote the stinkiest beach town in California article. So it became the laughingstock and ire of the state, leaving behind only a few brave soldiers, all of whom were like in deep poverty. Now it's having a revitalization because a lot of the Burning Man people moved there so they can build like Mad Max style art, but even those people are broke. So the state doesn't care.
Is it a source of lithium? Are there lithium deposits there? Or
that's what I was hoping you could tell me.
Oh, I don't know. I tried to do a story about like why are salmon, numbers so bad this year, and I don't think my manager ever wants me to do another fish story because it was like 4 months of trying to be like, what is going on? I'm so confused.
So there's a salmon shortage.
Yeah. So it was about like the salmon return. So salmon season was canceled. I care a lot about fish. Like my dad was a big fisherman, and so salmon season was like totally canceled for everybody except some like tribal people could take a couple. And it was like, why is it canceled? And so, some advocates were like, it's canceled because of the mismanagement from the Bureau of Reclamation, and like they didn't release enough water, and so the baby fish cooked, in like this reservoir, in this critical time, and that's why. And then it was like, well, okay, but like, did they? And like, could they have released more water? And there's like no one who's impartial to talk to in kind of...
Everybody in the salmon sphere is compromised by separate interests.
They either like care about giving water to farmers or they care about fishermen and the fish. It's super interesting. But it's like...
Nobody cares about the damn fish for real.
I think people care about the fish.
Yeah, but not the people involved in that catastrophe. Right? Was there people on the front lines just yelling at everybody, being like, salmon have a nervous system?
Yeah, I mean, there was, people who were like, who work as fishermen, fisherwomen. And
my mom used to work in a corporate company called Salmon Safe, and it was her job to secure the Duwamish and Willamette waterways and make sure that salmon had a safe passage without being illegally fished by those
cool.
Oregonian bastards.
Yeah. So like the best environmental story of the past 10 years in California is the Klamath, like the dams coming down and the fish returning to these areas that they haven't been for more than 100 years. I don't know if you've like...
It was a feel-good story.
Yeah.
Okay. That must be nice.
Yeah.
What percentage of stories do you feel like are feel-good in the environmental sphere?
Not a lot. Sometimes I just do like a space story to have like...
About outer space?
About outer space, yeah.
What's going on up there?
I haven't done one in a while. It's been a lot of not good feel stories. Not feel good
seems
stories.
Like there's nothing going on up there.
There'll be a comet or, more exoplanets discovered. There was one that was really cool. This high school student sonified supernova data and turned it into this like jazzy, like bluesy jazzy beat. And she won a prize for that. And
how do you turn data into a beat?
Look for patterns, and that can be your beat. You just make choices about how you use that raw data, and then apply like you artificially. You're like, all right, that's my baseline.
Did you interview her?
Yeah, she was really
awesome.
cool.
What's she doing now?
Off to college.
Oh, nice. Do you know where she's going?
Oh man, I forgot.
Well, shout out to her if you're watching this.
Yeah.
If we can find access to that song you created, that'll be our outro song. Everybody wants to know what supernova data and blues sounds like. Mississippi worldwide. Do you have any message to the people out there who may be watching and thinking, how can I keep my house safe from a future fire in the LA basin?
Think about hardening your home. Think about defensible space. Think about fire year round, and be safe.
Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was an enlightening conversation, and I hope that some prescribed burns happen sometime in the near future.
Me too.
Shout out to the burn bosses out there. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the great conversation. I learned so much.
If you ever get the chance to go on a prescribed burn, you should. It is like the opposite feeling of being on a wildfire. It's like joyful and fun and not stressful, and
Can you put me in touch with a burn boss? Is there one that you like?
I like them all.
There's got to be a spectrum of personalities.
Well, let's see. I mean, I would say just anyone that you can get on. You know,
Okay.
They're really they're neat people.
Channel 5 Live Worldwide, Hollywood and Vine.
Fuck the authority, Channel 5 News.
Channel 55. We don't fuck with custers. And 5 is the best number.